This lecture deals with how the New Deal affected America socially. So it affects many groups in many different ways. One of the ways it affects people is actually Franklin Roosevelt's wife. Eleanor Roosevelt becomes kind of the modern first lady, where she's very influential. She takes on some major charges and actually kind of works throughout the New Deal. FDR also has his labor secretary become the first female labor secretary, who is Frances Perkins, and that's obviously a very important cabinet position during the Great Depression as they're trying to combat the labor shortages. African Americans during the New Deal. In the 1930s, there's a growth of activism for African Americans. A. Philip Randolph becomes the head of the first all-black union, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, and he's going to push FDR to try to conclude some more civil rights legislation in his New Deal. They gain further positions. He appoints over 100 African Americans to positions within the government. Mary McLeod Bethune heads the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration. And despite these gains, FDR was never fully committed to civil rights. This is partially because he, being a Democrat, a lot of his support and a lot of his party draws its support from the South, where Jim Crow is still in effect. So if he had pushed for a lot of civil rights, he may have lost a lot of the New Deal legislation. So a lot of the New Deal legislation is not going to be targeted at a specific group like African Americans. It's really going to be a wide-ranging thing. Other groups that gained were Native Americans. They actually made advances during the 1920s and 30s. Somewhat ironically, they gained full citizenship as Americans in 1924. And FDR in 1934 reorganizes the ownership of Native American lands, giving them reservations. And the policy was moving away from assimilation more towards autonomy. This is also a cost-saving measure during the Great Depression, so that FDR does not have to finance the reservations any longer. And you can see that the reservations are moving out towards the western part of the country. Most of Oklahoma at one point was reservations, and lots of areas in the southwest are where these reservations are taking shape. So, as we discussed, FDR is going to win again his second term in 1936. He has wide appeal, and he's going to get a lot of appeal from urban areas, which is generally new for the Democratic Party. Groups like the African Americans, Jewish people, Catholics, and immigrants all support the popular president, which are a lot of new groups for the Democratic Party. Again, for most of our history, the Democrats were the southern party of the country. So the New Deal also kind of brings government into people's homes. FDR leverages radio, uses radio to speak directly to Americans about the policies and the issues that are going on. So his frequent fireside chats kept Americans going and kept Americans aware of what was going on in the government's policies during the Great Depression to try to gain more support for them. Popular radio shows at the time included Bob Hope, Jack Benny, so radio is a popular avenue for people to use. The first soap operas, which were named because soap companies sponsored them, and there's all different kids' afternoon shows. So this shows that radio is a significant thing for him to use to get to people. He also financed art. We have the Federal Art Project, which was part of the WPA. It paid artists a living wage to produce art. We have projects, different murals, posters, books. Much of the art and music is somber. We looked at some of the photographs from the Great Depression, and that is financed by the federal government, not only to, allow artists to continue working, but also to, show and document what was going on during the Great Depression. So there are critics of the Great Depression. One of them, the major one that we've been discussing, is the Supreme Court, where it'll go against a lot of the legislation that FDR tries to pass, including this court case, Schechter versus the United States. It's called the Sick Chicken case because the Schechter brothers owned a poultry business, and in 1933 they were convicted of violating the NIRA's live poultry code. They had diseased chickens and certain wages and hour provisions. So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that the Constitution did not allow the Congress to lend its powers to the executive branch. Since the NIRA was basically making legislation, that was not supposed to happen. This suggested that the Supreme Court would make some more decisions in regards to the New Deal. We talked about the TVA and other things in the New Deal that are going to be deemed unconstitutional. So how does Roosevelt try to get around this? He decides that he's going to try to propose legislation to to change the makeup of the Supreme Court. So it's called this court packing bill, where he was going to say that the president was allowed to name a new federal judge for each who did not retire after the age of 70 and a half. So setting an old age limit on justices. 6 justices out of the 9 were over that age limit, which would have allowed him to pick 6 out of the 9 justices. In addition to that, he wanted to increase the number of justices from 9 to 15. So out of those 15, he would have selected 12, giving him a massive say in what the Supreme Court was going to do, and also it was going to last way past his presidency. It is not passed by Congress, but a lot of his opponents looked at this and said, oh man, we have to be careful of this guy because look at what he's doing to try to take over the Supreme Court. So, the New Deal is going to be criticized both by the left, the more liberal areas of the country, and the right. The people on the right would claim that it was unconstitutional, it was socialism, it was anti-laissez-faire, and went too far. Others would claim that the New Deal did not go far enough. On the left-hand side, they wanted full-out socialism. So, some of the criticisms come from a lot of different areas. The government and the president are becoming too powerful. The Supreme Court is striking down this Constitution because he's making illegal laws. Our Father Coughlin will talk about, and Dr. Francis Townshend, we'll talk to specific critics, spends a lot of money, and it creates this welfare state where now governments American people are reliant on the government to live. So, Father Coughlin is one of the major critics, and he was basically more of a socialist, and he's a priest who goes on and has 10 million listeners every week, and he criticizes FDR. He says that there's an international conspiracy of bankers, and that's why FDR wasn't going to full socialism. He wanted a nationalization of the banks. He is a fascist. He had some anti-Semitic overtones, so he's going to be a supporter of people like the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, which is why the international conspiracy of bankers, a lot of times people associate bankers with the Jewish faith, so therefore that's kind of why he's saying that. Kind of in addition to Father Coughlin is this Dr. Francis Townshend. He's a retired physician, and he suggested giving $200 a month for people over 60 from the federal government. Open up jobs for the young so people could retire earlier, and if we said that they had to spend that money, then it would boost economic demand. Eventually, this creates Social Security. So you can see these two are kind of saying that the New Deal is not going far enough, more on the left-hand side of the New Deal. So, as we look at the New Deal, we see successes. It does stimulate the economy. It does not get us back to where we were. It does put people back to work temporarily. It improves morale and self-confidence, and the U.S. government's role changes and became directly involved in helping the people, which is the largest impact of the New Deal and the most everlasting one.